Most people think recovery means not training. The research says that is the wrong frame entirely. Recovery is an active process with specific measurable variables, and whether training produces adaptation or gets wasted depends almost entirely on how well those variables are managed. Before the specific variables, the mechanism needs to be clear. The reason recovery matters is not intuitive, and without understanding it, the recommendations that follow do not have a foundation. The stimulus recovery adaptation curve describes what happens after every training session. A training stimulus is applied. Performance temporarily drops as the body processes the stress and recovers from it. Then adaptation occurs, the body rebuilds slightly stronger than it was before. That supercompensation window is where gains actually happen. The training session does not build muscle. The recovery period after the training session builds muscle. The timing of the next session matters in two directions. If the next training stimulus arrives too early, before recovery and adaptation have completed, it disrupts the process and compounds fatigue rather than building on the adaptation. If it arrives too late, after the supercompensation window has already closed, the adaptive response has faded and the gains are left on the table. Dr. Mike Israetel has built a substantial body of practical work around this framework, including a September 2024 video on what he describes as the surprising new science of recovery. The core point is consistent with the research. The training session creates the conditions for growth, and recovery determines whether those conditions are fulfilled. Recovery is not rest for its own sake. It is the process that allows the SRA curve to complete. Every variable that follows is relevant only because of what it does to that curve. Sleep is the most important recovery variable and the most consistently undervalued one, not because it feels good, but because what happens without it is physiologically incompatible with adaptation. A study by Lamont and colleagues measured the direct effects of a single night of total sleep deprivation on muscle protein synthesis and the hormonal environment. The findings were specific. One night without sleep reduced muscle protein synthesis by 18%, increased cortisol by 21%, and decreased testosterone by 24%. These are not marginal changes. They represent a direct degradation of the anabolic environment the SRA adaptation depends on. A 2025 review of sleep and athletic performance confirmed the pattern across a broader evidence base. Even short-term sleep deprivation reduces strength, power, and endurance, and increases cortisol, while decreasing testosterone and growth hormone. The mechanism is anabolic resistance. When the hormonal environment is disrupted by poor sleep, the training stimulus cannot convert into adaptation at normal rate. The work has been done, the building conditions are not present. Jeremy Ethier, in a discussion with Dr. Mike Israetel, stated this directly. Getting less than 7 hours of sleep will cap muscle growth potential even when training is otherwise perfect. 7 to 9 hours per night is not a wellness suggestion. It is a physiological prerequisite for the SRA curve to complete. Sleep is not a lifestyle variable sitting outside of training. It is the primary regulator of the hormonal environment that determines whether adaptation occurs after each session. Compromising it consistently makes the training happen, but produces a fraction of the adaptation. Next is protein. Most people hit protein targets on training days, fewer people hit them on rest days. The research shows that distinction may be costing more muscle than most people realize. Muscle protein synthesis remains elevated for 24 to 48 hours after a resistance training session. The body is actively building muscle on rest days, not just on training days. The SRA adaptation, where the body rebuilds stronger than before, is occurring during those hours, and the building materials need to be present for that process to run. The most common pattern is protein intake that is solid on training days and significantly lower on rest days when the psychological trigger of the workout is absent. But the cellular machinery driving adaptation does not check the calendar. If protein is low on rest days, the synthesis process initiated by the previous training session is running without adequate substrate. A 2024 review by Lehman, published in Frontiers in Nutrition, examined protein distribution and its effect on muscle protein synthesis, spreading protein across meals, hitting roughly 30 to 40 grams per meal, rather than concentrating the majority in 1 or 2 large servings, consistently produced better anabolic outcomes. That distribution principle applies across the week, not just within a day. Rest days are not protein holidays. They are the days when the training session is being converted into adaptation, and that process requires the same building materials as any other day. Hitting protein targets consistently every day, including rest days, is a recovery variable. Missing it on rest days undermines adaptation at exactly the time when that process is most active. So, if your sleep is good and your protein is good, you're good to go, right? Not exactly. Research also shows that the optimal rest day is not just a day of doing nothing. A systematic review by Dupuy and colleagues published in Frontiers in Physiology compared recovery techniques and their effects on delayed onset muscle soreness and performance recovery. Active recovery, massage, compression garments, water immersion, and contrast water therapy all produced meaningful reductions in soreness. Passive rest showed no meaningful change compared to the control condition. A 2022 systematic review in the Strength and Conditioning Journal reinforced this. Active recovery protocols, including low-intensity movement, aqua exercise, and yoga, produced meaningful reductions in soreness, prevented muscle strength loss, and improved flexibility compared to passive rest. Greg Nuckols and Stronger by Science have consistently recommended active rest over complete time off, noting that low-intensity movement maintains readiness without competing with recovery resources. The practical application is walking, light cycling, easy mobility work, or any low-intensity movement that increases blood flow without imposing meaningful metabolic stress. High-intensity cardio on rest days is a different situation entirely. It competes directly with the recovery resources needed to complete the SRA cycle, particularly for lower body training, and should be accounted for as training load rather than treated as recovery. Active recovery outperforms passive rest on soreness, readiness, and maintenance of performance. The version of rest that helps most is not doing nothing, it is doing something easy. What about deloads? Deloads are one of the most prescribed tools in structured programming, but research on their actual effects is more modest than the typical recommendation implies, and that is worth examining honestly. A 2024 study by Coleman, Burke, Israetel, Schoenfeld, and colleagues, published in PeerJ, examined the effect of a 1-week complete deload during a 9-week training block. The deload had minimal impact on hypertrophy, endurance, or power. There was no meaningful evidence of a resensitization effect, no indication that the deload caused the subsequent training block to produce more growth than it would have otherwise. A 2026 study in Scientific Reports found no significant differences in hypertrophy or strength endurance between continuous training and a deload condition in untrained individuals. Greg Nuckols and Stronger by Science have noted that only trivial strength decreases occur over the first 4 weeks of reduced training, and any strength lost returns quickly when training resumes. Jeff Nippert has pointed out that deloads do not need to span a full week. 3 to 4 days of reduced training may be sufficient, and recommends planning them based on accumulated fatigue signals rather than a rigid schedule. The honest verdict: deloads appear most useful for managing psychological fatigue, reducing injury risk, and supporting long-term motivation rather than producing a measurable physiological resensitization. A deload does not mean a week off. Reducing volume by 40 to 60% while maintaining movement patterns is sufficient to dissipate fatigue without losing the neurological adaptation built over the previous block. Deloads are a fatigue management tool, not a growth catalyst. What they do support is arriving at the next training block less accumulated and more prepared to train hard consistently. Putting it all together, here's the recovery checklist. Sleep, 7 to 9 hours per night. Not a suggestion, a prerequisite. Poor sleep creates anabolic resistance that prevents the SRA adaptation from completing regardless of training quality. Protein on rest days. Hit the daily protein target every day, including rest days. Muscle protein synthesis runs for 24 to 48 hours after each session. The building materials need to be available while the process is running. Active recovery. Low-intensity movement on rest days reduces soreness and maintains readiness better than passive rest. Walking, easy cycling, light mobility work. High-intensity cardio should be treated as a workout. Deloads. Useful for managing accumulated fatigue and reducing injury risk across longer training blocks. Not demonstrated to produce meaningful resensitization or additional hypertrophy. 3 to 4 days of reduced volume is often sufficient. Base the timing on fatigue signals, not a fixed schedule. Recovery is not the absence of training. It is the process that determines whether training produces adaptation or not. Manage the variables and the training works. Ignore them, and the session happens, but the gains often do not. Want more fast fitness tips like this? Check out the next video here.